What if the one mental activity your doctor applauds, the one your family encourages, the one you've built into your daily routine because you read it was protecting your brain, is actually doing the opposite, not failing to help, not simply neutral, but actively working against the very thing you are trying to protect? Stay with me, because in the next several minutes, I'm going to walk you through research that, when I first encountered it, made me go back and rethink conversations I had been having with patients for years. I'm a neurologist. I have spent over 2 decades watching the brain age, in some people gracefully, and in others with a speed and severity that still stops me cold. I have sat across from hundreds of families at the moment when a diagnosis like Alzheimer's stops being a fear and becomes a reality. And I have spent more time than I can account for asking the same question. Where did we miss this? What were we getting wrong? What I found is that the answer, at least in part, is hiding in plain sight. It's hiding in something almost every senior in this country has been told is good for them. Something that feels productive. Something that genuinely seems to be working, right up until the point when it isn't. I'm not going to name it yet, because if I name it right now, you will almost certainly think, that's not me. I'm doing fine. I know what I'm doing. And you will click away before I can show you what the neuroscience actually reveals about what's happening inside your brain when you do it. Here is what I will promise you instead. By the end of this video, you will understand 4 things. Exactly what the activity is, the specific neurological mechanism that explains why it works the way it does, the difference between the version that protects you and the version that doesn't, and what to replace it with, starting today, based on the most current dementia prevention research available. There are now over 55 million people living with dementia worldwide. That number is projected to nearly triple by 2050. And the single most replicated finding in the last decade of prevention research is this: the window for meaningful intervention is not when symptoms appear. It is decades earlier. The habits you build right now, today, are either building a buffer or eroding one. Every single day. What you're doing in the name of protecting your memory may be the very thing you need to stop. My name is Dr. Amanda Carson. I am a neurologist, and for more than 2 decades, my work has lived at the intersection of 2 questions that most of medicine treats separately. Why do some brains decline, and why do others not? I have reviewed brain scans of patients in their 50s who showed early amyloid accumulation, the biological fingerprint of Alzheimer's, while reporting no symptoms whatsoever. I have sat with patients in their 80s whose cognition remained sharp, whose memory was intact, whose brains on imaging looked a decade younger than their age. I have spent years trying to understand what separated those 2 groups. Not just genetics, not just luck, but the daily choices, the habits, the specific ways each group was spending the hours of their cognitive lives. That question has taken me deep into the neuroscience of cognitive reserve, the brain's built-in capacity to absorb damage and keep functioning. It has taken me through decades of longitudinal research on dementia prevention, through studies tracking thousands of older adults across years and sometimes across entire lifetimes. And it has brought me, more than once, to findings that directly contradicted what I had been telling my own patients. That is an uncomfortable place to sit as a physician. When the research moves, you have to move with it, even when it means acknowledging that the advice you gave in good faith was incomplete, or worse, that it was pointing people in the wrong direction. And here is what I've spent the better part of my career watching people get wrong. Not the people who ignored their brain health entirely. Those cases, as heartbreaking as they are, follow a more predictable path. I'm talking about the engaged patients, the ones who showed up to every appointment, the ones who read the articles, followed the recommendations, and made genuine effort, the ones who were doing, by every measure they had access to, the right thing. Many of them declined anyway. And when I looked closely at what they had in common, one pattern kept surfacing: a specific category of mental activity, one that had been widely recommended, broadly celebrated, and almost never questioned. An activity that felt, by every intuitive measure, like exactly what a brain trying to stay sharp should be doing. The research tells a more complicated story, and that story is what this video is about. I want to be precise here because precision matters when we are talking about the brain. This is not a claim that mental activity is harmful. It is not a claim that keeping your mind engaged is wrong. The evidence for cognitive engagement as a protective factor is real and it is robust. What I am about to show you is something more specific than that, and for many of you, more urgent. Because effort alone is not enough. The type of effort matters enormously, and most people are spending that effort in exactly the wrong place. Here is what you've always been told. If you want to keep your brain sharp as you age, you need to keep it challenged. Use it or lose it. Do puzzles, play word games, work through crosswords every morning. Keep the mind active, keep the mind engaged, and the mind will hold. It makes complete sense. On the surface, it is almost airtight logic. The brain is like a muscle. Exercise it and it strengthens. Leave it idle and it atrophies. So you pick up the crossword. You do the Sudoku. You work through the word search after dinner. You sit down every morning with your puzzle book and you feel in a very real and satisfying way that you are doing something, that you are being proactive, that you are one of the people taking this seriously, not one of the people who will look back and wish they had. And the medical community for a long time did nothing to discourage this. Crossword puzzles for brain health became one of those recommendations so embedded in popular health culture that it stopped feeling like advice and started feeling like fact. Magazines ran it, physicians mentioned it, families bought puzzle books for aging parents as a genuine act of care. A landmark study published in the Journal of the International Neuropsychological Society followed a large group of older adults over time and found that participants who regularly did crossword puzzles showed delayed onset of memory decline compared to those who did not. That study was real. It was widely cited. It traveled through the health media ecosystem and became the scientific foundation for an entire category of brain health advice. And so people did the crosswords, millions of them, faithfully, daily, with genuine intention. There is just one problem. Delayed onset is not the same as prevention. And the mechanism behind that delay, what is actually happening neurologically when you work through a familiar puzzle, is not what most people think it is. In fact, when researchers began looking more carefully at what crossword puzzles were and were not doing to the aging brain, they found something that changes the entire picture. The delay was real, but what came after it told a different story entirely. Participants who relied heavily on crossword-style training showed something unexpected when cognitive decline eventually arrived. It arrived faster, more steeply, as though a reserve had been drawn down in a way that left less buffer when the real erosion began. This is not a fringe finding. This is not one contrarian study. This is the pattern that emerges when you follow the data past the headline, past the reassuring early results, and into what happens over time. You were told the puzzle was protecting your brain. You were never told what it might be costing you. That is what we need to talk about. To understand what's actually happening, you need one concept. It's the most important idea in modern dementia prevention research, and most people have never heard it explained clearly. Cognitive reserve. Cognitive reserve is not your memory, not your IQ, not how well you score on a test. It's your brain's structural capacity to absorb damage, to lose neurons, accumulate the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's, and still keep functioning. It's the buffer between what's happening to your brain biologically and what you actually experience in daily life. This is why two people can have nearly identical Alzheimer's pathology on a brain scan and live completely different lives. One is in a memory care facility. The other is still sharp, still working, still holding full conversations. The difference is not the disease. The difference is reserve. And here's the finding that changes everything. Cognitive reserve is not fixed. It is built. Through specific types of mental engagement, the brain develops more pathways, more flexibility, more alternative routes for information to travel when the primary routes begin to fail. The 2024 Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention identified building this reserve as one of the most powerful tools available for reducing dementia risk across a lifetime. Now, here's where the crossword problem becomes visible. Building reserve requires novelty. The brain must encounter problems it hasn't solved before, recruit new neural pathways, form new connections. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. It's the mechanism through which genuine protection is built. Crossword puzzles, in the early stages, do exactly this. When you first start, they're genuinely challenging. Your brain is reaching, building, forming new connections. This is why the early research found a benefit. The benefit was real at first, but the brain is extraordinarily efficient. It learns, and once it has learned the patterns, the vocabulary conventions, the structural logic of crosswords, it stops building and starts retrieving. What still feels like mental effort is no longer the same neurological event. It has become pattern recognition, familiar retrieval, the cognitive equivalent of walking a path through a forest you've crossed 1,000 times. You are not building new pathways. You are deepening existing ones. And deeply rooted, highly specific pathways do not transfer. Research on cognitive training has consistently shown that gains from repetitive, domain-specific exercise do not generalize to broader cognitive function. You get better at crosswords. You do not get a more resilient brain. This is what makes the timing of decline so revealing. The reserve crossword devotees appeared to build was largely puzzle-specific. When Alzheimer's pathology began eroding the broader architecture of the brain, that narrow buffer offered far less protection than it appeared to. The decline, when it came, had further to fall, and less underneath it. The puzzle wasn't building the wall, it was painting it. So when you see a senior who has done crosswords faithfully for 20 years suddenly experiencing rapid memory loss, it's not a mystery. It's not bad luck. It's not a failure of effort. It's the logical endpoint of everything I just explained. The decline isn't arriving despite the puzzles. In many cases, it's arriving in the shape the puzzles created. A narrow reserve, built deep in one specific domain, that masked what was quietly happening underneath until it couldn't anymore. Researchers at Columbia University followed dementia patients who had been regular crossword participants through the full arc of their decline. The crosswords had delayed onset. That part was true. But the rate of decline, once it began, was measurably steeper in those who had relied primarily on repetitive, domain-specific mental activity. The buffer was real. It was also thin, and when it gave way fast. The confusion wasn't a sign that something had gone wrong. It was the defenses finally running out. Now here's what genuine protection actually requires. The mental activities that build durable, transferable, broad-spectrum reserve share 3 specific characteristics that daily crosswords do not. Novelty, ongoing, real novelty, not a familiar format with unfamiliar answers. Complexity, the kind that forces the brain to coordinate multiple cognitive systems at once, not retrieve from a single, well-practiced one. And what researchers call generativity, activity that requires the brain to construct something new, not simply recognize something old. A 2024 study from the Can Protect research found that the strongest predictors of maintained cognitive function were activities combining social engagement, novel problem solving, and the active learning of new skills, not the rehearsal of existing ones. A separate line of research examined speed-based cognitive training, exercises targeting processing speed rather than domain knowledge. A landmark study published in early 2026 found that as few as 5 weeks of this specific training was associated with a 25% reduction in dementia risk, measured 2 decades later. Not 20 years of crosswords, 5 weeks of the right kind. That is not a small distinction. That is the entire argument. Your brain doesn't need more of what it already knows. It needs to be genuinely surprised, genuinely challenged, asked to do things it has not done before, in ways it has not done them. That is what builds the wall. Everything else is just painting it. I'll tell you about a patient named Bernard, 74 years old, retired civil engineer. The kind of man who had spent 40 years solving complex structural problems and was not about to let his brain go without a fight. Crossword puzzles every morning for over 2 decades. Sudoku every evening. A puzzle app on his phone. Daily streak unbroken for over a year. By every measure available to him, Bernard was doing everything right. His son brought him in after noticing what family members always notice first. Bernard would repeat a question he'd asked 20 minutes earlier, no memory of having asked it. His keys turned up in the refrigerator, his reading glasses in the bathroom cabinet. At dinner one night, he lost the name of his son's wife, a woman he'd known for 19 years. Bernard wasn't panicked. He was an engineer. He had researched this. He knew about the studies. He was doing the puzzles. He could not understand why it wasn't working. When I reviewed his cognitive assessment, the picture was precise. His performance on pattern recognition, structured logic, the exact categories that crossword and Sudoku training directly reinforces, all of it was holding. That architecture was largely intact. But his episodic memory, the system that records and retrieves new experiences, was deteriorating. His processing speed had dropped significantly for his age. His cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift rapidly between different types of thinking, was showing early but measurable decline. The specific systems that repetitive puzzle training does not reach and does not build were the ones beginning to fail. He had spent 2 decades reinforcing a structure that wasn't the one under threat. I walked Bernard through the same explanation I've walked you through today. He listened in the focused silence of someone running calculations. When I finished, he said, "So I've been stress testing the roof while the foundation was cracking." That's exactly what he had been doing. And it's exactly what millions of people are doing right now, every morning, with the best possible intentions. Bernard restructured his routine based on what the evidence supported. Within 12 months, his processing speed scores had improved. His cognitive flexibility had stabilized. The trajectory that brought his son to my office had shifted, not reversed entirely, but measurably, meaningfully altered. He still does the occasional crossword, but now he knows what it is and what it isn't. That distinction, it turns out, changes everything. So what does the evidence actually support? What does genuine cognitive reserve building look like in practice? Not in theory, not in a research laboratory, but in the daily life of someone over 60 who wants to give their brain the best possible chance. Let me be as specific as the research allows, because vague advice is not advice, it is noise. The first and most important principle is this: novelty must be ongoing, not one time. Learning a new skill provides neuroplastic benefit while it is genuinely new. The moment the brain has mastered it, the moment it transitions from construction to retrieval, the reserve building largely stops. This means the goal is not to find one new activity and repeat it for 20 years. The goal is to remain in a state of genuine learning, where the brain is regularly encountering demands it has not fully solved yet. The second principle is complexity across multiple cognitive systems simultaneously. The activities with the strongest association to cognitive reserve in the research literature are not ones that isolate a single mental function. They are ones that require the brain to coordinate memory, attention, processing speed, and social cognition at the same time. Here's what the evidence points to specifically. Learning a new language. The bilingualism research is among the most replicated in cognitive aging. Adults who actively learn and use a second language show structural brain differences, greater gray matter density in regions associated with executive function, and consistently later onset of dementia symptoms compared to monolinguals with equivalent pathology levels. You do not need fluency. The active, ongoing process of learning is where the neurological benefit lives. Learning a musical instrument. Playing music is one of the most cognitively demanding activities a human brain can perform. It simultaneously recruits motor coordination, auditory processing, memory, attention, and, when played with others, social cognition. Research published in neuropsychology literature consistently shows that musical engagement in older adults is associated with stronger cognitive reserve and slower decline. You do not need to have played as a child. Starting at 65 still builds reserve. Speed-based cognitive training. This is the category of intervention with some of the most striking recent findings. The research covered by Hopkins Medicine in early 2026 found that a specific type of processing speed training, not memory games, not crosswords, but exercises designed to push the brain to process visual information faster and more accurately, was associated with up to a 25% reduction in dementia risk measured 2 decades later. The training involved as little as 10 hours of structured sessions. The brain's processing speed is one of the earliest cognitive functions to decline in Alzheimer's, and it is trainable. Genuine social engagement with novel content, not passive socializing, but conversations that introduce new perspectives, new information, new problems to navigate. The Can Protect research identified this as a significant independent predictor of maintained cognitive function. The protocol I recommend to patients over 60 is built on 3 pillars. 1 activity that is genuinely new and being actively learned. 1 activity that combines cognitive and physical demand simultaneously, because the evidence on exercise and brain health is as strong as anything in this literature. And structured processing speed training, at least several sessions per week, using tools specifically designed for this purpose. 20 minutes of brisk walking, 30 minutes of active learning in a new domain, and regular speed-based cognitive training that pushes the brain's processing capacity rather than its retrieval capacity. That is the protocol. It costs very little, it requires no prescription, and the research behind it is not preliminary. It has been accumulating, replicating, and strengthening for decades. We were told that keeping the mind active was enough, that the crossword every morning was the answer, that the puzzle on the phone, the word game after dinner, the Sudoku before bed, all of it was adding up, building toward protection, holding the line. Nobody was wrong to believe it. They were working with incomplete information in the most honest possible way. But now you know why it's incomplete. The brain is not protected by effort alone. It's protected by the specific kind of effort that forces it to build new architecture, new pathways, new connections, new structural redundancy that survives when the familiar roots begin to fail. Repetitive, domain-specific mental activity, no matter how faithfully practiced, does not build that architecture. It maintains a narrow room while the rest of the house quietly changes around it. Bernard spent 2 decades reinforcing a structure that wasn't the one under threat. And when the decline arrived, it arrived fast. Because the buffer was real, but it was thin, and there was less beneath it than anyone had been led to expect. The crossword wasn't the enemy. Believing it was sufficient, that was the problem. Here's what changes when you understand this. You stop measuring your brain health by how consistently you finish the puzzle. You start measuring it by how genuinely uncomfortable your mental activity feels. Comfort is not a sign you're doing well. It's a sign your brain has already mastered what you're asking of it and has stopped building. The 2024 Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention is unambiguous. Genuine cognitive engagement meaningfully reduces risk. But genuine means novel, means complex, means generative. It means your brain is being asked to construct, not just retrieve. You now have that information, not as a vague recommendation, as a mechanism you understand from the inside. You know why the familiar puzzle feels effortful, but isn't building what you need. You know what the brain actually requires. And you know the window to build it is not closed, but it is not infinite either. Start today, not with a resolution, with one concrete change. Replace one session of your regular puzzle routine with something genuinely new. A language app, an instrument, a processing speed training session, something your brain does not already know how to do. That discomfort you feel in the first session, the frustration, the sense that you're not very good at this yet, that is not a problem. That is the sound of your brain building something that will matter. Don't wait until the morning it's needed most to find out whether what you built was enough. Share this with someone you care about. There's someone in your life doing the crossword every morning with the best possible intentions, and they deserve to know what you now know.